A lot of teams look at their Azure Virtual Desktop or AVD bill and they just see one number. They know it feels too high, but they can't clearly explain what is actually driving it, right? The problem is that AVD cost is not one thing, right? AVD costs can come from a combination of sort of licensing and access rights, plus the underlying sort of Azure resource consumption. And that resource consumption can span virtual machines, storage, network bandwidth, and even identity-related infrastructure, right? I mentioned this in my last video. If you don't understand how these pieces are going to fit together, it's going to become very difficult to know where to optimize and where not to waste time. So in this video, I want to break AVD costs down properly, right? Not just at a sort of headline level, but in the way you should actually think about it. And especially when you're building a business case or you're reviewing an existing deployment, or even trying to figure out why that monthly spend keeps drifting upwards. One of the reasons AVD is attractive is that it offers a very different cost model from that traditional VDI, right? It's described as a service where the organization pays for the Azure resources used to provide desktops and applications. The customers can reduce costs by using multi-session windows, scaling capacity up and down, and applying pricing options such as reservations or the sort of Azure savings plans for compute. But it's also made very clear that the owner of AVD deployment is responsible for those, right? Responsible for those connected Azure resources and their cost. In other words, AVD gives you the tools to be efficient, but it doesn't remove the need for good architecture and cost governance. That is why this video matters. Okay, if you think about AVD costs only as desktop VMs in Azure, you will miss the supporting services and the operational behaviors that have a direct impact on that bill. Okay. Microsoft's own guidance breaks the cost model down into explicit components, which gives us a clean way to analyze where your money is actually going. Right. The first thing to understand is the AVD is divided. The cost is divided anyway into two major categories. Okay. The first is user access rights and licensing. How Microsoft explains this is that some licensing costs must be paid in advance, and whether you need to pay extra for the user access depends on the licenses your users already have. For many internal users, access rights may already be covered by eligible Microsoft 365 or Windows licensing, right? And that's why some organizations barely notice that sort of AVD service side of sort of the cost. And instead, like I said this in my last video, right? They focus almost entirely on the Azure bill. And the second bucket is the Azure resources consumption, right? And this is defined as the total of all those Azure resource charges. And it's required to provide that VDI or that virtual desktop or app experience. Okay, that does include the session host virtual machines. It includes storage, network bandwidth, and those supporting components such as identity infrastructure, depending on how that environment is designed. Okay. This is normally the part of the bill that fluctuates month to month and that creates the most pressure for optimization. So when someone asks, how much does AVD cost? The right answer is not sort of a single number, right? The right answer is, what license do your users already have? And what Azure resources are you consuming to deliver the environment? I'm actually going to start with the Azure infrastructure side, right? The most important cost component is usually compute, okay, because that's the one that fluctuates the most. There's a lot of documentation again on this, but it explicitly states that session hosts are virtual machines, so the normal Azure compute charging model does apply. Also says that the major VM-related charge components, the virtual machine instance, storage for sort of managed disk, and network bandwidth, sort of the virtual machine instance usually costs the most. That means if you want to understand why an AVD deployment costs what it costs, usually begin with the session host layer, okay? There are three main reasons session host compute can become too expensive, right? The first is running too much compute for too long. Azure charges for compute when the VM is running, so a session host that stays on when it's no longer needed is an obvious source of waste, okay? If you look at Microsoft's pricing page and the sort of cost guidance, they both make the point that one of the core advantages of AVD is being able to increase or decrease consumption on demand. If that does not happen in practice, the business loses one of the main economic benefits of moving virtual desktops into Azure. Okay, the second is oversizing the VMs, right? Teams often choose larger SKUs when necessary. And it's because they're trying to protect user experience, okay? That logic makes sense at first, but in a cloud consumption model, it's very expensive, if not tested against sort of real usage. Okay, again, that same cost guidance I mentioned earlier from Microsoft doesn't tell you which SKU to choose, but it does make it clear that session host cost is one of the most important variables. What that means is right sizing is not a nice to have, it's one of the key controls for cost. Okay, the third is poor session density in pooled environments. Right? If users are spread too thinly across too many hosts, the environment may look healthy operationally, but still be inefficient financially. Again, a lot of guidance online around this. Microsoft's autoscale documentation requires a configured max session limit, and I mentioned what this does before in my last video. This is for pooled host pools as well, and it specifically says not to use that default value. Okay, this is a strong signal that effective session density is directly tied to whether the platform can make good scaling decisions. So let's talk practical terms, right? When you see a high AVD bill, the first question should usually be, are we paying for more running compute than our real user demand actually requires? So even though the VM runtime is usually the biggest cost driver, again, there's more guidance online. It makes it clear, especially from Microsoft's guidance, that the session host cost is just the VM instance. It also includes storage, right, for managed disks, for the OS, and any additional data disks. That means every session host carries a storage footprint as well as a compute footprint. If the environment has too many hosts, that disk estate grows with it, right? If a large disk types are chosen without a good reason, that's going to inflate cost even further. This is one of the reasons why the host count matters so much in pooled AVD. It's not only that every extra powered on host burns compute budget, every extra host also carries its own disk and infrastructure footprint. What they don't do in Microsoft documentation is it does not describe this as a sort of primary cost concern, but it explicitly includes OS and additional data disk as part of the host cost model. And this means it should be part of any proper breakdown. So when you review AVD cost, don't frame the question as, how expensive are the VMs? This is how you should frame it, really. How many hosts do we have? What disk footprint do they carry? And what is the infrastructure, and is that infrastructure justified by actual demand? Okay, the next big area as far as where your actual money is actually going is the user profile storage. Again, there's loads of recommendations about using FSLogix profile containers with AVD because it makes profile immediately available at sign-in by dynamically attaching a VHDX or VHD container. And Microsoft highlights the benefits around performance as well, the allo cache mode and OneDrive support in non-persistent VDI environments. This is the part of what makes modern AVD environments feel usable and consistent across session hosts. But there is a cost implication here, okay? Again, the recommended approach is using Azure Files or Azure NetApp files for storing FSLogix profile containers. That means profile storage is not just some background share somewhere, right? It is a dedicated storage design decision that has both performance and financial consequences. Choosing the right storage option depends on the workload, the required responsiveness, and scale of user activity. If the storage choice is too expensive for the persona, you'll end up overspending. If it's underpowered, the user experience is going to degrade. There's also the issue of profile growth, right? While, again, the documentation from Microsoft focuses more on how FSLogix works and how to configure it, the implication is clear. A complete user profile stored in a single container will accumulate application state, cache, settings, and user-related data over time. Again, the configuration guidance also recommends setting different sort of registry entries. And I mentioned some of these in my last video. There's things like delete local profile when VHD should apply, and there's a flip-flop profile directory name. Okay, and these are operational aids to help ensure profiles are managed consistently and local profile confusion is reduced. Those settings do not directly reduce AVD spend on their own, but they contribute to a cleaner profile model. And again, that helps prevent operational sprawl and confusion around where user profile data is actually living. The key point here is that your AVD cost review ignores FSLogix storage. It's going to be incomplete if it does. Right, again, there's a lot of guidance and it strongly positions profile containers as a central part of the AVD user experience, which means the storage platform and growth behavior are central to the AVD cost model as well. If this kind of sort of breakdown is useful, real Azure and AVD content based on the actual guidance from Microsoft, who's the vendor, but explained in a way you can actually use in the real world, make sure to subscribe to my channel. I'm building it from scratch again, and I really appreciate your support. I'm building this for people who actually deploy, design, and operate Microsoft Cloud environments. So another component Microsoft explicitly includes is network bandwidth, right? In the cost guidance, it lists network bandwidth as one of the sort of charges tied to session hosts. What this means is network usage is part of the infrastructure bill, even if for many environments it's not the biggest or largest cost line item, right? The mistake that IC teams make here is treating it as just totally irrelevant. In a well-designed environment, the VM runtime and profile storage will often dominate, but that does not mean bandwidth should be ignored completely. If your workload includes higher levels of data transfer, regional design choices, or supporting services that create additional traffic patterns, those costs can become more visible over time. Again, the cost guidance does not provide a blanket amount for each scenario, which is exactly why teams should measure and observe rather than make assumptions. So, in the context of an AVD cost breakdown, network bandwidth is usually, again, not the first place I'd try to optimize, but it absolutely belongs on the list of components you understand and monitor. One of the most important points I want to try and make in this video is about the cost guidance that is linked to identity provider choice, and this changes the charge components as well, right? Microsoft explains that if you use Microsoft Entra ID only, the cost profile looks one way, right? With the free tier available and license features for so many functions such as conditional access. If you use Microsoft Entra ID together with Active Directory Domain Services or ADDS, then you introduce domain controller VM costs. This includes storage and networking, and it brings a larger picture, right? This matters because many teams talk about desktop costs without looking at the identity model behind the desktop. If your AVD environment depends on additional infrastructure to satisfy legacy requirements, then that supporting environment is part of the AVD cost story. The platform itself did not create those costs, right? But the way the deployment is designed determines whether they are present. Again, there's a lot of security recommendations, right? But Microsoft specifically reinforced this from another sort of angle, right? Makes it clear that while it manages the AVD control plane, customers remain responsible for securing and operating their session hosts, applications, user access model, and related supporting components. That means the design choices around identity, access control, and security are part of the environment the customer owns, and therefore part of the broader economic picture as well. So if your bill feels high and the cost review has never included how the identity is delivered, what extra infrastructure that identity model needs, even whether those dependencies are still actually justified, are you still using legacy applications that need a domain controller, right? You probably need to, probably do not yet have a full cost breakdown if you're not thinking about those things. Once teams understand the major cost categories, they often jump straight into discount mechanisms, right? There's a pricing page, and I'll put that in the link in the description, and it highlights 3 major ways to pay for compute in AVD, right? There's pay-as-you-go, Azure savings plans for compute, and reservations. Okay, pay-as-you-go gives sort of maximum flexibility, and it's useful for sort of changing demand, right? Savings plans, on the other hand, lower rates by committing to a fixed hourly spend over 1 or 3 years, right? And it's better suited for dynamic workloads that still have meaningful compute usage. Then there's reservations, right? And these provide discounts through, again, 1 or 3 year commitments for specific instances, and these are better suited to more predictable, steady state workloads. Okay. Again, Microsoft prevents these as sort of pricing models, but none of them changes the underlying requirement to design the environment properly. What that means is if the environment is already insufficient, right, it's inefficient, committing to discounted compute can actually lock in poorly optimized usage. Okay, the sequence does actually matter, right? So here's how it should look, the sequence. Number 1, understand the workload. Number 2, size and scale the environment correctly. And then number 3, apply the pricing option that fits the usage pattern. Okay, so the discount model does matter, but it should come after the cost breakdown, not instead of it. If I were explaining an AVD bill to an IT manager, architect, or a finance stakeholder, I'll describe it like this. First, check whether user access is already covered through existing Microsoft licensing. If it is, then the real economic conversation is about the Azure infrastructure, not AVD licensing in the broad sense. Again, the guidance that Microsoft gives us makes that distinction very clear. Second, break the infrastructure side into different areas, right? Session host compute, for example, host attached storage, profile storage, network bandwidth, and identity related supporting services. Third, you need to ask which of these categories are driven by real user demand and which are driven by design choices that might no longer be necessary. That is where the optimization opportunity usually sits. Okay, that practical breakdown is much more useful than simply sort of staring at a monthly Azure invoice and trying to guess which line item feels too big. So if you take one thing away from this video, it should be this. An AVD bill is not one cost, right? It is a stack of cost categories working together, right? Look at the public guidance because it makes that very clear. You know, licensing and access rights, session host compute, managed disks, profile storage, network bandwidth, and those supporting identity services all contribute to that total. Okay, it's not just one thing, it's combined. Once you see the environment in those layers, you can actually stop guessing and start asking the right questions. Which layer costs the most? Which layers are based on real demand? And which ones are inflated by avoidable design decisions? That is where real cost optimization begins. In the next video, I'm actually going to go even deeper into one of the biggest cost layers in AVD, compute efficiency, auto-scaling, and how session host behavior affects your Azure bill. And if there is a specific area you want me to break down next, like FSLogix, networking, auto-scaling, or even Windows 365 versus AVD, or even any Azure architecture, put that in the comments below and I'll build it into this series. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button. See you on the next one.